All right, before we get going in John 18, let's start with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for all the blessings that you've given to us. Thank you for this opportunity to come together and to refocus ourselves off of the trials and tribulations and the distractions of life and to focus completely on you and on your Son, Jesus Christ, and what he did for us on the cross. I just ask that you would open our eyes to behold wonderful things from your law, and that you would help us to see the truths that you have intended for us, that you would help us to not just be hearers of the word, but to be doers of the word, and to live differently in light of what we see from you in your word. Please give us wisdom again as we look into your word. Help us to be attentive. And in Jesus' name, amen. John chapter 18 is where we're at. So this is the last night of Jesus' life. He's going to be crucified the next day. So we saw in John chapter 18, verse 1 through 11, Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. So the time has come for Jesus to be glorified, he says in John 12. And his glorification takes place through his death, through his humiliation. Again, it's the exact opposite thinking of the way the world thinks. The world thinks you look best when you're the highest. That's not the way God sees things. God says you look best when you humble yourself. And that's what Jesus Christ was going to do on the cross. And we noted verses 1 through 11, Jesus went to the cross willingly. So he's not a victim in this story. He chose to go to the cross. He says in John chapter 10, "No one takes my life from me. I give it up on my own initiative. I'm doing this willingly because of my love for people." And that's what we saw in verses 1 through 11. Jesus could have at any time called down 12 legions of angels. He could have any time gotten away. He could have let Peter, cut off Malchus's ear and let him fight for him and get his disciples and riled everyone up. But he didn't. In verse 11 of John 18, Jesus said to Peter, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" So he willingly went to the cross out of his love for the people. So last week what we looked at was verses 12 through 27. We started his trials, his court trials. We noted he has 6 total trials. He has 3 Jewish trials that are more religious in nature. Then he has 3 Gentile trials, which are more civil in nature. So the Gentiles are looking for what crimes did he commit. And the Jews are looking for what has he done spiritually. What's his spiritual crime that he's committed? So we looked at verses 12 through 27 last week. Jesus before Annas, the high priest, or the ex-high priest, as we noted. And they met in the middle of the night, so this was not a legal thing at all. They were supposed to meet during the day, because you're not supposed to just be able to take people to court without anyone knowing. You're not supposed to be able to sneak people into court like this. And they can't find anything wrong with him. Annas is trying to get him to speak something that he can use against him, but they're not able to find him doing anything wrong. So Annas, even though can't find anything, he declares him guilty. We can't find that he's done anything wrong, but he's guilty. It's basically the summary of that first trial with Annas. And mixed throughout that trial, remember, we saw Peter's denial of Jesus Christ. So we kept going back and forth. It showed us a little bit of Jesus' trial, then it went to Peter denying Jesus again. And if you haven't noticed, the worse that humans appear to be, the more despicable that mankind is, the more Jesus is betrayed. Thank you. I'm going to need those, I think. The more Jesus is betrayed and mistreated, the more glorious he appears. Jesus is doing these things. He's giving himself up on the cross for sinners. God demonstrated his own love towards us in that while we were good people, he died for us, but while we were sinners, while we were enemies of God, he gave himself up. So, again, Annas got nothing from him but declared him guilty. In verse 24, they sent him to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So Caiaphas is the official high priest. The Sanhedrin is the governing body of Israel. And this is his second trial. And John doesn't record the details of the second and the third trial. He knows that we have access to the other Gospels, so he doesn't go over the same material that the other 3 Gospels go over, but you can read about it in Matthew 26 and 27 if you'd like to. But they meet together, and it's pretty much the same as with Annas. They try to get testimony against him. So they even bring some false witnesses. But it says the false witnesses couldn't get their story to match together. which is very hard when you're lying. It's hard to get two people who are lying to match their story together. And they weren't able to do it. They weren't consistent in their testimony, it says in Matthew chapter 26. So they meet, they try to get testimony. They can't find anything wrong with him. They can't prove anything. But again, they declare him guilty from this second trial. And that's in Matthew 26. They beat him, they spit on him, they prophesy, tell us which one of us beat you, and they punch him in the face. That's after his second trial, where he also too is found guilty. So the third trial, again, is in Matthew chapter 27. And what the Jews want is they need the Romans' help to put Jesus to death. And we'll look at that a little bit today. But that's what they want to do ultimately. They don't just want to beat him up. They want to put him to death. But they're not allowed to do it legally, so they need the Romans' help. Only the Romans can put people to death. So the third Jewish trial is again with the Sanhedrin, and they wait till the morning when the Romans are ready to go. And this third trial, the purpose is to officially charge Jesus and send him to the Romans for execution. So we officially have, after these three Jewish trials where they find no evidence but declare him guilty, 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 we officially have what John chapter 1 says, he came to his own people, and his own did not receive him. He's rejected by his own people. They want him dead. They declare him guilty. So that's what we're going to pick up this week, is in John chapter 18, starting in verse 28. Is what we're going to see. And John includes some details, leaves some details out, as we've already seen through these trials. Remember, though, that John doesn't just pick things out randomly. So John didn't just see everything that happened and say, well, this would make a good story, and bring that out and say, I'm going to write about that. Remember, John chose certain things. He says, I chose these things so that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing you might have life in his name. So he was very specific. I chose to tell this part of the story so that you would believe in Jesus. So again, keep that in mind. John wants you to believe in Jesus as we go through these stories. And two major points I want to draw out from the text today is, first off, that Jesus was put to death even though he was innocent. And you might take that for granted, but that's actually a really important point. You know, if Jesus was guilty of a crime that was worthy of death, we're still in our sins. If Jesus was crucified because he was guilty, he died for his own sins, well then who's paying our penalty? He was paying his own penalty. So it's very important that he was innocent, but still crucified anyways. 1 Peter chapter 2 says he committed no sin. He was killed even though he committed no sin. And then we'll really see this today. We'll see his innocence from the Jews because they are corrupt. And we'll see his innocence from Pilate, where Pontius Pilate actually tries Jesus and declares this man is innocent. And we'll see, I think that's really important. And then number two, we'll also see Jesus' defense before Pilate. So Pilate declares Jesus innocent, but Jesus doesn't just passively defend himself and say, I want Pilate to declare me innocent. He declares the truth. And we'll see that. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says, Christ Jesus testified the good confession before Pontius Pilate. So we'll look at what that good confession is. So let's go ahead and we'll start in verse 28, and we'll just kind of work through the text as we're going through it. So verse 28. So again, this is after they've gone to Annas, they've gone to Caiaphas, they've gone to Caiaphas the third time. Verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. So they're done with the three Jewish trials. They're done with the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas. They declared Jesus guilty. Now it's time to take him to the Romans. And again, they take him to the Romans because in verse 31, they're going to say, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. So they want Jesus officially, publicly executed. So they take him to the Romans, the praetorium. The praetorium is the headquarters of the governor. So Pontius Pilate was the governor at this time, and his official station was up in Caesarea. That's where he spent most of the time. But during the big feasts like Passover, when all the Jews were in Jerusalem, the governor would go down too, just to kind of make sure things are okay, make sure there aren't rebellions going on, make sure there aren't riots, try to keep their eye on things. So Pilate is down in Jerusalem at a temporary place called a praetorium. That's the name of it. It's kind of a cool name. We're thinking about that for our next kid, maybe. Maybe not. But they take Jesus from the Sanhedrin to the praetorium, to Pilate's house, verse 28. So they take him to the praetorium, and it was early. And this word, it was early. That means it's the fourth watch, which is 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So it's sometime within 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And I know some of you are thinking, that's not early, that's late. But it's early for normal people, okay? 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. is early for normal people. But Roman commanders would work from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. So they would get started very early and work the beginning part of the day and be done for the day. So this kind of makes sense. The Sanhedrin, their third and final meeting, they wait until Pilate gets into work at 6 a.m. about. And then, okay, Pilate's in. Let's take Jesus there now so we can get this crucifixion going. So that's what's going on here. So they take him to the praetorium, and it was early, verse 28. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So the Jews got to the praetorium, but they refused to go into the praetorium, into Pilate's house. And the reason for this is according to the Mishnah, which the Mishnah are just some kind of extra biblical writings that talked about the Mosaic Law and made some, interesting points, and it's kind of a commentary on the Mosaic Law. But the Mishnah was full of all sorts of extra rules. So they thought the Mosaic Law had 613 commandments they had to follow. The Mishnah had all these extra rules that they had to keep. And one of those rules was you can't eat in the house of a Gentile. You can't go into the house of a Gentile, or you're impure for a few days. And so and Numbers chapter 9 says that if you're unclean during the Passover, you have to wait to eat the Passover. You can't eat it with the rest of the nation because you're unclean. So the Jews don't want to go into this house because they want to eat the Passover, which is that very day. And it's interesting to note, as I was kind of looking through this a little bit, it's interesting to note how carefully the Jews followed every jot and tittle of the Mosaic Law. Every detail of the Mosaic Law, even things that weren't in the Mosaic Law. They followed it so carefully that they weren't even following things that were in there. Again, the Mosaic Law didn't say anything about going into a Gentile's house defiling you, but they were so careful about these laws. We don't want to defile ourselves. Well, at the same time, they're improperly putting to death the Son of God. So focused on these external rules and this external defilement and the Mosaic Law, and we got to keep it so perfectly, but they're putting to death the point of the Mosaic Law. And it even mentions here that they want to eat the Passover meal. They're putting to death the true Passover lamb. We're told from the book of Hebrews. So you can really see the hypocrisy here. I think that's why John includes this personally. But it's ironic. The law was written to point people to Jesus, and they seem to follow the law, but at the same time, they're putting to death the writer of the law. It's very ironic. You can see their true nature. You can see how blind the Jews are to the truth. Focus completely on the external when their hearts, what does Jesus say? He says, on the outside, you look great. You've cleaned the outside of the cup, but inside, you're dirty. You're full of dead men's bones, Jesus says. And that's very true of these people. So again, they don't want to go into the house. They don't want to defile themselves by the dirty Gentiles. And I was thinking it's probably more likely they're going to defile the Gentiles than the Gentiles are going to defile them with what they're doing here. But verse 29, since they won't go in to Pilate's house, Pilate comes out to them. It says there, 29, therefore Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? So Pilate was familiar with the Jews and with their customs. He'd been the governor of Israel for the last about 4 years. So he knew the Jews. He said, they're not going to come into my house. I got to go out to them. And just a little background on Pilate. I think this helps you understand the story a little better. He was appointed by Emperor Tiberius in about 26 AD. So that's about 4 years before this story. And he was very unpopular with the Jews. In fact, when he first came into Jerusalem, he brought with him a big statue of Caesar. And the Jews did not like that. They have in the Ten Commandments, don't take any graven image among you. So the first thing Pilate does, he comes in with this huge Caesar statue, and the Jews start hounding him. The priests followed him around everywhere he went and said, get rid of that statue, get rid of that statue. And finally, Pilate got tired of it, and he said, you know what, if you bring up the statue one more time, I'm going to kill you. And the priests, they stuck out their neck and said, fine, kill us. It's that important to us. And Pilate was embarrassed because he didn't actually want to kill him. They called his bluff. But there are all sorts of problems with the Jews and with Pilate. Another time he took the money out of the temple to build an aqueduct. And the Jews went and complained to Caesar Tiberius, hey, he's taking our money. And so Pilate and the Jews did not get along. And also Pilate and Caesar did not really get along that well. Caesar was tired of all the trouble that had been in Israel. He was tired of the Jews keep coming to him saying, hey, we don't like Pilate. He's causing trouble. He's taken these... One more story I read about Pilate. I thought it was really interesting. I'm kind of a history guy, though. But he brought in these shields with Emperor Tiberius on them to honor Emperor Tiberius, and the Jews didn't like it. They said, that's a graven image. Get that out of here. They complained to Caesar, and Caesar Tiberius was furious with Pilate. He says, get rid of those shields. Quit causing trouble. I don't want to hear about Israel ever again in my whole life. Paraphrase. I don't know that he actually said that. But that's the idea. Is he was tired of hearing about Israel. So keep that in mind as you're going through the story. It starts to make a little more sense in chapter 19, verse 12, when they say, hey, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. And they basically are telling Pilate, hey, if you don't do what we want with Jesus, we're going to go talk to Pilate again, and you're going to be dead. So Pilate is a very shaky relationship with the Jews and also with Caesar. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So back to verse 29. Therefore Pilate went out to them, again, shaky relationship here, even with the Jews, and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? What's the charge? And that's a reasonable way to start a trial. If you want me to put this man to death, what's the charge against him? What's the accusation? And from the way this conversation goes, I think this question startled the Jews a little bit. The fact that there were Roman soldiers in the garden, remember back when they arrested Jesus at the beginning of chapter 18, means that Pilate knew that they were going to arrest Jesus. So he'd already talked with the Jews, and they told him, hey, there's this rebel, and he's causing all this trouble. We're going to go arrest him. Send your Roman soldiers with us. And I think what the Jews expected is that they would just bring Jesus to Pilate and say, hey, this man deserves to be killed. And Pilate would say, okay, yep, put him on the cross. So I think Pilate comes out and says, what's the charge against him? And they kind of panic a little bit. And I think maybe, again, speculation, but I think maybe Pilate did this to get back at the Jews a little bit. Now, you want him dead? Okay, well, what's the charge? Let's hold a trial here. What is his crime? And this is a big problem for the Jews because remember, they just spent the whole night trying to find a crime for him. They couldn't find anything. They had no way to answer this question. They could have said, well, he's planning a rebellion against Rome. And Pilate would have said, okay, so where's your witness? Well, we couldn't find any witnesses. Said, okay, well, case dismissed or whatever. So again, they spent the whole night trying to come up with charges so that Pilate asked them this question. I think they're a little panicked. So verse 30, they don't answer him. It says, they answered him and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. So if he hadn't done anything wrong, we wouldn't have brought him to you. It's amazing to me how sometimes I've seen this happen before where people who are in the wrong turn things around to make other people look like they're in the wrong. And that's basically what the Jews are doing here. Pilate asks, what's the charge against him? Seems like a reasonable question. And they say, how dare you? Do you think we would bring someone to you if there was nothing wrong, if he hadn't done anything? When that's exactly what they had done. But they basically tell Pilate, that's insulting. We would not have brought him to you if he hadn't done something. So just trust us. He's guilty. Put him to death. So verse 31. So Pilate said to them, take him yourself and judge him according to your law. So again, I think Pilate doesn't like the Jews. He doesn't like their attitude. So I think he's being a little snarky here. You guys snarky ever? I like snarky replies. He's a little snarky here. He says, okay, no problem. You don't want me to be the judge. You're the judges. You go ahead and judge him. Go ahead and judge him according to your law. And I think he knew in his mind they can't put him to death, which is what they want to do anyways. So he tells them, fine, if you want to be the judges, you go ahead and judge him. In verse 31, the Jews said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. So Pilate had him. When Rome conquered Judea in 6 AD, they took away the right of capital punishment. Ius gladius, what they call it, the right of the sword, and they took it away. They said, only Rome can put people to death. So Pilate knew this. He said, give me the respect I deserve as the judge. Let me work through the facts of this case, and then I will put him to death if he's deserving of it. So, and then there's a little bit of debate, verse 31. So they take him to Pilate because they can't put anyone to death. Then there's a little bit of a debate as to, well, why didn't the Jews just form a mob and put Jesus to death the same way they did Stephen? We're in Acts chapter 4, I think it is. They just create a mob and they kill Stephen. Why didn't they do that with Jesus? Why not just create a big mob and kill him? And there's a lot of debate. I think they're worried about a riot and the Romans getting upset and coming and taking their power. I tend to think that they wanted this officially done. They wanted Jesus officially put on public display as we reject this man and his teaching, and he's being put to death for what he said. But whatever the case, we're told the ultimate reason why they took him to the Romans instead of doing it themselves in verse 32. Verse 32 says, "This was to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die." So Jesus, throughout his whole ministry, starting back in John chapter 3, he said, "The Son of Man must be lifted up." In John chapter 12, he said, "The Son of Man must be lifted up from the earth." And John chapter 12, verse 33 says he was saying this to indicate what type of death he was going to die. Remember, in those days, being lifted up was an idiom for being crucified. It's like if I was to say, "I'm going to the chair." You guys know it's an idiom for the electric. Hopefully you understood that, what I was saying there. The same thing, it's an idiom for crucifixion. So Jesus has said through his ministry several times, "I'm going to be crucified." So if he says he's going to be crucified and then the Jews end up forming a mob and stoning him, well, he's a liar. He's not the Son of God. He's wrong about how he's going to die. What else could he be wrong about? So he had to die by crucifixion, which was the Roman method of execution, not the Jewish method. Also, too, we don't have a whole lot of time to get into it because of my game. Sorry about that. But the Old Testament also predicted that Jesus would die on a tree. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. Again, we don't have the time to get into it, but Galatians 3, Paul says, "Everyone who sins is under a curse." So you have to, if you've sinned, which we all have sinned, fall short of the glory of God, someone has to be cursed for you to be saved. And Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23 says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." So Galatians 3, Paul says, Jesus Christ was cursed for you by hanging on a tree. So if he was stoned, that wouldn't work out right. So even the Old Testament planned this, that Jesus would die on a tree. And all these prophecies are coming fulfilled here in verse 32. And it's amazing to see God's hand working through all these circumstances. These men who hate God, they hate his Son, they're wicked to the core, but they're still acting in accordance with God's eternal plan. God is still in control, orchestrating this, how it needs to be done. Very comforting, ISIS and the election, all the different things we have going on. These are part of his perfect plan. We do not need to fear anything. His Son's death, part of his perfect plan. So, verse 33. So they take him to Pilate. Pilate says, "I'm going to confirm these facts. I'm not just going to put someone to death for no reason." So verse 33, "Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus." So again, the Jews hesitantly allow Pilate to question Jesus. Pilate brings Jesus into the praetorium and wants to question him privately to see if there's any credence to what the Jews are saying about him. So he said, verse 33, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He asks him flat out, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And the way it's worded is, "You, the king of the Jews?" And the way it's worded, there's skepticism in his voice. So I don't think Pilate is an idiot. I think he understands, okay, this guy, it seems like the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, just want you dead. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but it doesn't seem like you are a king of some sort. He may have been in Jerusalem on the previous Sunday when Jesus came in on a donkey. Says that's not a kingly thing to do. So he asks very hesitantly, "So are you the king of the Jews? Are you the king?" But you can kind of see the charge that the Jews had decided to bring against Jesus. Again, they're trying to think of what's the accusation that what can we say that the Romans will care about that will make Jesus worthy of being put to death? And they decided what they would say is, he says he is a king. He says he is the king of Israel. We see this in chapter 19, verse 12. Again, it says, as a result, Pilate made efforts to release him. The Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." And down in verse 15, "So they cried out, 'Away with him, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priests answered, 'We have no king but Caesar.'" So this was the Jewish official charge against Jesus, is he says he is the king of the Jews. That makes him a rebel. It makes him a seditionist. He's inciting rebellion, saying that he is the king of the Jews. And that's what Pilate asks him. So are you the king of the Jews? Are you going to start a rebellion? And you'll notice Pilate doesn't ask him, are you the Son of God? He doesn't ask him, are you the Messiah? Pilate doesn't care about any of that. The Romans, for the most part, let people, whatever you want to do worship-wise, go for it. We don't care. What we care about, are you going to start a rebellion and make my life difficult as the governor of this province? That's what he wants to know. Are you going to cause problems with Rome? Are you the king of the Jews? Verse 34. So Jesus answered him, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? So this question, are you the king of the Jews, is a difficult question for Jesus to answer. It's kind of an ambiguous question. I think the Jews probably thought they were pretty clever in framing it this way because technically he is a king, right? He said that many times through his I am the king. So they know that we can get him to, he'll have to say yes to that question, that I am a king. But on the other hand, he's not a king in the way that's a threat to Rome. He's not starting a rebellion. So I think the Jews thought, that's a good charge. I'm glad I thought of that. That's smart. They send that into Pilate. He says he's the king of the Jews. Ask him. He'll admit it. So Pilate asks him, and Jesus answers him, do you want to know if I'm the king, or do the Jews want to know that I'm the king? This clever way that Jesus responds here. He says, if he is speaking to the Jews about whether he's the Messiah, the true king of Israel, then absolutely yes, I'm a king. But if you're asking me as a Roman governor, then no, I'm not a king in any sense that's going to bring trouble against you. So he tells him, are you asking, or are the Jews asking? Are you asking on your own initiative, or are you being a puppet for the Jews, basically? Verse 35. Pilate answered, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done? So Pilate says, I don't care about what the Jews say about you. That means nothing to me on this religious Messiah stuff. I don't care about that. I'm not concerned about the Jews' charge. I want to know, are you a threat to me? You look harmless, but everybody's in a frenzy about you. Are you a threat? And also, again, keep in mind how often the Romans fought rebellion, even in Israel. In fact, I was looking again through their history, and it seems about every 5 years, someone new rose up and brought up an army and fought against the Romans. They were going through this all throughout the Roman Empire. Rebellions all over the place that they were trying to put down. So I think Pilate is trying to figure this out. Are you going to start a rebellion? So verse 36. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. So Jesus gets at the heart of Pilate's question. Again, Pilate wasn't actually asking, are you a king or not? He's asking, are you going to start a rebellion against us? So Jesus tells him, I am a king. I have a kingdom, he says, my kingdom. I have a kingdom, but my kingdom is not of this world, he says in verse 36. And this is a really tricky phrase. We could probably spend our whole night on this, but we're not going to. It's a tricky phrase that all sorts of people have taken to mean all sorts of things. But I think if we look real carefully, it's pretty clear what he's saying here. The word kingdom here in verse 36 is actually, it's more the idea of kingship. So it's more the idea of my power. So he says, my power, my right to be king, my right to rule is not of this world. You know, different kings have different rights that they claim. This is why I can rule. I can rule because my father ruled before me. Some people say, I can rule because I conquered you. You know, different people have different claims to their power. This is why I'm king, because of this. And what Jesus says, my right to rule is not of this world. And of this world, another tricky phrase, but it denotes the origin. So then that makes sense with kingship. So what Jesus is saying here, paraphrased by Jimmy, the redhead edition of the Bible, my right to rule does not come from this world, is what he's saying in verse 36. And again, this really shouldn't cause as much trouble as it does. Jesus explains what he means in the second half of verse 36. So he says, my right to rule does not come from this world. Verse 36 continues on, if my kingdom were of this world, so if my right to rule came from this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. So Jesus, I think, makes real clear, if my right to rule came by raising an army to conquer the Romans, my servants would be fighting. When Peter cut off Malchus's ear, I wouldn't have healed it. I would have cut off his other ear. That's that'd be a bummer. That's what he would have done. That's Pilate could relate to this. Every other rebellion that had ever started in the Roman Empire had involved rebellion. It involved fighting of some kind. People rising up to fight. And Pilate, and maybe he already had, asked the soldiers, hey, you went to the garden to arrest this man who I'm about to question. Did he fight back? Did you have to chase him down and fight him? Oh, no, he came right out and gave himself up. And then we tried, one of his people tried fighting him and he stopped him. So I think Pilate sees, okay, yeah, this is right. Jesus is not a threat here. He's not guilty of rebellion. Again, Jesus could have let Peter chop off Malchus's ear. I was thinking about, when he fed the 5,000 men, he could have easily made an army out of those men. It's like, I'll feed you from these 5 loaves every day if you fight for me. I was reading, Pilate is estimated he had 3,000 troops in all of Israel at this time. Jesus could have, like that, gotten an army bigger than 3,000 people to take over Rome if that's what he'd been interested in. So he says, but as it is, so if my kingdom were of this world, if I got my right to reign from this world, my servants would be fighting. The Jews wouldn't have gotten me so easily there. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. I don't get my right to rule as king. I am a king, but my right to be king is not through fighting. That's what he says. Verse 37, Pilate, I think, wants to just clarify one more time. Therefore, Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Again, Pilate wants to make sure he has everything straight. His neck is on the line here. If he gets this wrong and there's this big rebellion, he's probably dead. Caesar's not going to handle another uprising in Judea. So you are a king. Just want to make sure I had this clear. Verse 37, Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. So I am absolutely a king. I am the King of Kings, Revelation says. He is the ultimate king. Verse 37, for this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world. So Jesus wants to clarify, I'm not saying that I'm not a king. To be a king is my purpose in coming. I came to rule over people, to have subjects under me. He says, for this I have been born. I think that's talking about his humanity. Bethlehem, I was born to be a king. And for this I have come into the world. I think that's talking about his divine nature. So you see his human nature and his divine nature. I was born to be a king, and I existed and came into the world to be a king. See both his divine and his human nature there. I was born for this purpose, to be a king. Verse 37, but his means of becoming king, again, is not fighting. My means of becoming king are not of this world, he says, verse 37, but is to testify to the truth. So Jesus Christ's kingship comes not by conquering people with the sword. He brings subjects into his kingdom by testifying to the truth. That's how people get into God's kingdom. He doesn't chop their head off and say, now, well, that wouldn't work, but now you're my subject. No, he testifies to the truth. The truth connects people to Jesus Christ as the king. And there's a lot of confusion. We could spend a long time on this verse. There's a lot of confusion about people saying, oh, look, this kingdom is not of this world. That means Jesus' kingdom is only in our hearts. It's not a physical kingdom. There's not going to be ever anything different on the world, on the earth, because his kingdom is not of this world. I don't think that's at all what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus isn't here to describe the kingdom to Pilate. Pilate doesn't care what the kingdom that Jesus is bringing, that he doesn't even believe in. He wants to just get at the heart of the issue. Where's the power for this kingdom coming from? Jesus says, not by might, but by the truth. So again, I think we are looking forward to a future earthly kingdom on this earth. Jesus Christ is not reigning as the king of the earth right now. And I know this because who's running for president in the United States. Not to get political, but Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. If Jesus was king of the earth, it'd be two better people. I will say that. So we have a future kingdom where Jesus will be the king on the earth. But for now, we're becoming citizens of that future kingdom by the truth. By believing in the truth, we become citizens of that kingdom. Our citizenship is in heaven, where we look forward to his kingdom here on earth. So again, verse 37. This is why I came, to be king, to testify to the truth. Bear witness to the truth. And two things, we're almost done here, but two things I want you to notice about the truth here. He came to testify about the truth. The first thing I want you to notice is that there is absolute truth. And it's kind of sad that you have to say this, but in our day today, you have to say that. There's a lot of people you'll talk to on campus who say there's no such thing as truth. Your truth is just as good as my truth. What's true to you might not be true to me. That's not the truth. There is absolute truth. There is a reality of how the universe works, of who God is, and of our sin, and it doesn't change. It comes from outside the world into the world. The world doesn't think it up. You don't think up your own truth. There's not a truth for you and a different truth for me. Every person, regardless of race or gender or anything, has the same truth, the same reality. That's the first point I want to make, is there is absolute truth. And number two, that absolute truth can only be found and understood through Jesus Christ. He is the only access to that reality, to that truth. John chapter 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And that's why Jesus came into the world, was to show this truth. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. He gave us truth to illuminate the way things really are. And that's what light does, isn't it? It shows reality. That's what light does. If you turn the lights off, if you're a wreck when you wake up in the morning, I am, or so my wife tells me. I'm just kidding. But if you're a wreck when you wake up in the morning, you kind of hope the lighting's a little dim, and then you go into the bathroom, you turn the light on, you're like, oh no, what's going on? Turn the lights back off. That's what light does. It shows the reality of who you are. It shines the light. It shows you. And that's what Jesus Christ did when he came to earth. He shows reality, the reality that you are a sinner, that there's a penalty for your sin, there's judgment for your sin, and that Jesus Christ paid the penalty for your sin. And if you trust in him, if you believe that truth, he becomes your king. You're guaranteed a place in his future kingdom. So that's what he came to do, was to testify to the truth, to shine the light for his people. Verse 37, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So there's a direct correlation between your relationship with the truth and your relationship with Jesus Christ. If you believe the truth, you hear Jesus' voice. There is no one who knows the truth who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ. Truth and Jesus Christ go hand in hand. Again, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. So if you reject Jesus Christ, you're living in a figment of your own imagination. You're not living in reality. You're making up your own stuff. You must be connected to Jesus Christ. You must hear his voice. Be part of his kingdom. Have him as your king. And verse 38, and we'll close with verse 38 here. So we see Pilate's response. So Jesus has essentially shared the gospel with Pilate. He's on defense for his life, and he takes that opportunity to not just defend himself, which he did a pretty good job, but he also uses it to share the truth. Pilate, even you, I want you saved. Hear my voice, and you'll know the truth. The truth will set you free. Verse 38, Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. So again, that's Pilate's conclusion. Pilate runs a trial, a legitimate trial, and he determines no guilt, zero guilt on Jesus Christ. And we'll pick up there next week. But what is your response to the truth? Again, it's kind of tragic, Pilate's response here. Pilate's conclusion after the Son of God is before him, expressing the truth, testifying to the truth, His determination, his conclusion is, what is truth? There's no way you can know the truth. Everybody has their own opinion. There's no way to know what's absolutely true, what isn't. That's a tragic answer. And unfortunately, that's the conclusion a lot of people, maybe in this room, have come to. I don't know the truth. What is truth? There's no way that you can possibly know. You can know the truth. And the truth is Jesus Christ. So do you hear his voice? And are you of the truth? Are you part of his future kingdom? Are you a citizen of that kingdom? Is he your king because of your relationship to the truth? Let's go ahead and we'll close with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for coming to the earth for us. We know that you didn't have to come to earth, that you could have left us in our sinful state and left us in that terrible condition. But thank you for the love with which you have for us, where you sent your Son to die for us. I just ask that you would help us to have that same type of love for the lost and to just be willing to testify ourselves to the truth that we have seen in your word. Please be at work in our hearts in this upcoming week, again, to not love the things of the world, to not be conformed to the world around us, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, by the truth of your word. Please be at work in our hearts and in the hearts of each person here tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Shall I fear? side.